we go. And we are live.
All right. Well, um, we are back with me interviewing Jerry and Jerry interviewing me, I guess. And
Chatting together. That's a better way to describe it, I think, rather than an interview.
yeah.
Yeah.
And oh, it just says my name on the screen there, but my YouTube channel is The Bitter Pill for anyone who didn't watch us last month or doesn't know in general. And so, I guess today we're going to mainly talk about sort of what's going on with COVID and COVID policy in China and, what the Western media is saying about it and how accurate that is.
And then after we've talked about that, you're going to answer a couple of questions about Ukraine, because I know nothing about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay.
But so I guess one thing to start with, maybe we can talk about what the changes in China's policy have been and what effect that has had as far as the spread of COVID in China. So I guess we can start there.
Okay, well, the change in policy was that they went from having lockdowns to prevent the spread to saying we're not going to lock down anymore. We've given up on attempting to prevent this spread of COVID. And I think the reason for that, there were basically three reasons for that. One of the reasons was a paper released on about the 5th of December, written by Zhong Nanshan. Now, Zhong Nanshan is very, very famous in China. Every Chinese person knows his name. He's the Dr. Fauci without the sinister side. He's a good guy. He led China through the original SARS back in 2003, and he's led China through the COVID response in 2019, 20, 21, 22. So he's been the person that the government listens to. He's based in Guangdong. And over a period of time, he studied the most recent. He's been studying this all the way through, but he's got a team of researchers, and they studied the most recent cases in Guangzhou. Now, the Guangzhou, when they were still counting, was well over 150,000 cases in the city. Now, that may seem a lot, but the city has 20 million people. So when you think about it like that, it's not that big a deal. But 150,000 cases in any city is a big deal. Now, what Zhong Nanshan had found during the 4 or 5 weeks of that outbreak, with the lockdowns associated with it, with all the restrictions on going in and out of Guangzhou, you literally couldn't go in or out of certain parts of Guangzhou. If you went in, you weren't allowed to leave. If you tried to leave, they would have detained you, which has happened on a couple of occasions, and it's made news headlines. They weren't letting people out, and they weren't letting people in to those controlled zones. Now, as a result of his paper, which was released, I think, on the 5th or 6th of December, he found of that 150,000 cases, not one had died. None were suffering extensive injuries or illnesses beyond what appeared to be a heavy cold, some with a minor flu, 1 or 2 bronchial injuries, but hospitalization wasn't required for most of the cases. And as a result of that, which happened at the same time as those street protests that we had around about the early first week of December, those two factors came together, and the government said, well, we now know the people aren't happy. We now know that this is not as life-threatening as we thought it was. Omicron has become less of a danger, or at least the variants that are in China are less of a danger, apparently. And Zhong Nanshan has found this with his paperwork. Now, what has happened? We're seeing reports throughout Go on.
Let me just bring up a point there that I'm kind of puzzled about.
Yeah.
I can't bring this up on screen because we're having issues with my computer connecting with yours, and I'm on my phone again. But let me, I can just turn the camera around here and show your viewers this. Can you see that? Okay, is it?
Not clearly, no.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. Well, I'll just talk about it.
Just talk us through it, Jeff.
Yeah. So I've got daily new confirmed COVID deaths for Japan, which is having probably the world's worst outbreak right now. The United States and China, and on these 7-day average as of December 28th. Japan is having 314 deaths per day. The United States 289, and China none at the moment. Although it's
there's factors involved in this. A lot of people are saying they don't believe the numbers. Okay, I get that. It's hard to believe. There's other factors. One is that very, very high percentage of fully and boosted vaccinated people. It's well into the 90%. Now, that's one factor. People keep saying, but there's thousands of unvaccinated. There are, but they're in vulnerable communities and they're being kept safe. That's one aspect. The second aspect is there is a massive amount of traditional Chinese medicines being used, which the West don't want to use. I don't know what Japan does. I have no idea at all. But certainly America, if you say to America, take this Gamma Ling for your cold, they're going to go, fuck off. I'm not going to take any Chinese rubbish. That's the way it is. But it works. Well, it's a fact. It's a fact. So there is that aspect of it. Now, the other aspect is maybe the Chinese death rate hasn't caught up yet because this is a relatively new outbreak in China. So I'm sure Robert has just come on and said there are deaths. I'm certain there are deaths. Beijing has approximately 400 deaths every single day. So does Shanghai. 27,000 people in China die every single day. That's not going to change. That's not changing at all. Now, what has happened is that there's been a massive amount of sickness and sick leave taken from work. So just if I can give an example, this is an analogy, right? I have a friend who runs a restaurant. He was telling me he has two problems or three problems. One is that he's got a massive amount of takeaway orders, a massive amount of takeaway orders. Okay, so he's got this massive amount of takeaway orders to deliver, but he has only half of his catering staff available. So he's slow in preparing the food. When the food is prepared, only 30% of the drivers are available because the number of people who've caught COVID in the last 2 weeks has literally been exponentially massive. I'm not kidding you. Every single person that I know has caught COVID in the last couple of weeks. My wife and I both had it. My wife's mother, my wife's father, my wife's sister, my wife's nephew. My brother-in-law thinks he had it but didn't take a test. He's the only person I know who is not confirmed because he hasn't taken a test. But he did have a sore throat. He did have a cough. He did have a cold and sniffles. He's had headaches for several days. It's fairly certain that he's had COVID. I'm fairly sure. Every single person that I know has had time off work. So this is causing a backlog inside of places where services are required. There's not enough staff there. And I've no doubt funeral homes, crematoriums are suffering that as well. But I'm not saying that people aren't dying of COVID. I'm saying that the other factors, this is not the huge death race that people were talking about. There's little data, but I think what's going to happen, the data will come out. China doesn't lie about this stuff. It never has in the past. It never will. It will come out with the data. We'll see the excess death rates. We'll see the information. China is saying if you have COVID and you die of a respiratory problem, that's counted as a COVID death. If you have COVID and you die of cancer, they're not counting that as a COVID death because COVID didn't kill you. Cancer killed you.
Let me just interject a couple of points here. First of all, just to make sure your listeners understand this, we've got Omicron everywhere in the world, like a huge number of different variants of Omicron. That's all there is. So when we say, well, Omicron, China is having fewer deaths partly because Omicron is weaker, that's only true to a limited extent. I mean, as I said, hundreds of people are still dying a day from Omicron. in, for example, Japan and the United States. And
but also Omicron has different variants within the Omicron variant. I'm not sure how much aware you are of this, but the one that we're having in Guangdong is quite mild, for sure.
Yeah.
And just to give you an example, I'll give you another example. I have a former student who contacted me a week or so ago. We were supposed to meet for a coffee. She said, I can't meet. Half my class have got COVID.
Yeah.
So we arranged to meet the following week. And I contacted her and said, I can't meet you now because I've got COVID. So 2 weeks in a row, we couldn't meet. And she said to me, so have I. In my school now, almost every single person in the school has got COVID.
Yeah.
And I contacted her yesterday saying, I'm recovered. How are you? She says, I'm fine now. Mine only lasted a couple of days. And I said, what about everybody else? She said, every single person who had it is now back at school. Now, okay, now you think about a school in America and you might think of 400, 500, 600 kids. This is a school with 20,000 students. This is a proper Chinese school. There are 60 kids in her class.
Wow.
All 60 of them have had COVID. All 60 of them have recovered. So whilst I'm not saying there aren't deaths and there aren't going to be deaths, I'm saying that it's quite clear that the Omicron that's hit us is a lot less pathogenic than the Omicron that seems to be hitting Japan, Australia, and America. A few weeks ago, I was saying they can't open up because it's still killing 3,000 people a week. And that was true.
Okay, but
people aren't dying here.
Opened up, for one thing. Nobody's not opened up anymore. There's a lot of overlap in what variants are in different countries. I checked yesterday, and most of the same variants that are the leading variants in China, and there are a whole bunch of them, are also the leading variants in the United States. There's something else that differs, and I guess it could be some combination of catching it early, and maybe, although it doesn't prevent infection really well, maybe the Chinese vaccines are working. I don't know. You're just speculating. Maybe they're working better at preventing deaths. Maybe those traditional Chinese medicines or other medications that China is using are working better to prevent people from getting seriously ill.
I think there's a lot to be said for therapeutics. We've got the vaccines. Almost, I don't know anyone who's not vaccinated. My mother and father-in-law are both in their late 70s, both vaccinated. My brother-in-law is in his 70s, vaccinated. We're all double or booster vaccinated. Every single person that I know. And I think there's 5% of the people in China still not vaccinated, 5%. And that is a huge number. That's 70 million people. And of that 5%, I believe 80 or 90% of them are vulnerable people who can't be vaccinated. So what they've done now is they've introduced the inhalant vaccine. And that's being offered to these people who can't take the injection. But even some people can't take those too. So those people are being looked after in a different way. Don't ask me how. Someone says they can't find Jeff's YouTube. When they search the bitter pill, find no channels.
Okay, I can.
I'll put it into the description afterwards.
Yeah.
That's what we'll do.
Let me just, it's just at the bitter pill. If you look on YouTube, that's the address.
One word?
Yeah, at the bitter pill, one word.
At the bitter pill.
Yeah. Let's see what, I was about to say something here.
Right.
Well, one thing that's happened in the United States is that at times the number of vaccinated people who are dying is greater than the number of unvaccinated people who are dying.
That's because more people are vaccinated.
Well, right. Okay. But that exactly, 68% of people are vaccinated, but more importantly, 90% of elderly people are vaccinated, and they're the most vulnerable group. So vaccination takes them from being really likely to die, 15% likelihood if you're over 70, to, pretty unlikely to die. But still, most of these people are not boosted. That's a big problem in the United States, is that, the overall booster rate is like 34%, which is way lower than China. and higher than that for elderly, but not high enough. So I think that's a large part of what's happening in the United States, is that people who really need to be boosted are often not getting boosted. So.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to go into the epidemiology, the virology aspects of it. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about the mRNA vaccines. There's a lot of people saying that the Chinese vaccines don't work. Is it at the bitter pill or AT? I don't know. That's a good.
Yeah, the at sign.
The ampersand, I think. Okay. So I wrote AT, the bitter pill. You should have. I should have picked up on that. Sorry. We're getting into all sorts of conspiracy theories, but the bottom line is this. Right now, China is in the very early phases of a massive wave. Now, what will come out as a result of this, and it really is so massive, it's impossible to define this. I went out for a walk on Christmas Day in the afternoon, and there was almost no one around. Now, Christmas Day is a Sunday. And in China, Christmas Day is just another working day, no different to any other day. But the place was deserted. It was like Christmas Day in London. It was deserted on Christmas Day because everybody's having a holiday. But it's not. It's just a normal day here. And nobody is out there. And the reason nobody's out there is because they're either sick at home, B, isolating at home, or C, staying at home because they don't want to catch this thing that everybody else has got. And this is what's happened in China. We're going to go through a huge learning curve, steep learning curve, when we start to assimilate the information that becomes available once the dust settles on this. What the Western media are showing with cues of people burying their dead, it's just crap. It's bullshit. It really is. There are going to be deaths. There's no question about that. Those number of deaths will be higher than the normal number of deaths in any given city. But the reason why there are delays. I even saw one headline today saying China can't bury enough people, so it's mandating crematoriums. They've mandated crematoriums years ago. They don't bury anybody now. They burn everybody who dies. That's been the law for years. But there really are lots of things going on right now, and it will all be sorted out eventually. It just takes some time. So I just got Jerry's cam needs upgrade. Oh, not that one. China dodged the Alpha and Delta. That's also true. Jerry's cam. I'm sorry. I'm just on my laptop. This is my laptop's camera. This is all I get. I do have a decent camera for doing the video work that I usually do, but this is just my laptop.
Yeah. Well, my phone's camera is really good, but unfortunately, I can't do anything else except be on camera with the phone. But one thing, while I'm thinking of it, I just wanted to comment on the astounding hypocrisy and racism of the Western reaction to the outbreak in China, where you have countries like the United States, and Japan, both of which have among the worst outbreaks of COVID in the world in terms of number of deaths and probably number of cases, although like China, they are currently, undercounting because people don't always report when they, or usually don't report when they home test. But they have imposed policies where they are requiring travelers from China and only China to present a negative test when they enter the country, even though in all likelihood, both of those countries, the United States and Japan, are probably having as bad or worse an outbreak than China.
I see that as a little bit of a tit for tat situation. For the last 3 years, China has required anyone coming into China to go through quarantine, to have a series of tests before they're allowed out into the community. And now they're saying it's our turn to do it to you. And I think that's it's childish. It's a game, but it's a fact. I think that's just a tit for tat.
It has nothing to do with science, obviously, because there are lots of countries that are having major outbreaks of COVID.
Well,
Right?
you can travel easily from the UK, where there's still dozens of people a day dying, into America, but they want to stop Chinese people. It basically is just a xenophobic attack on
Yeah,
Chinese people.
yeah, exactly. And
Mm.
it's oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Maybe it'll come back to me. Um, yeah, I'll think of it later.
This is from an Australian media. Shady Hazards in Australia. Karen Phelps, who's quite a famous um, TV host,
Yeah,
come to harm her and her partner. The conspiracy theory has gone mainstream. And basically, we don't know. Nobody knows unless you're a virologist, unless you're an epidemiologist, unless you know this stuff and have read the papers. Commenting on them is just stupid. You're going to make yourself look foolish
how many
by having opinions based on what you read on Twitter or what you're reading in Murdoch's press, and
how
that's a
many
big
what?
problem. Yeah, and this is true in Australia. There are 200 deaths in Australia. That's this week, not today. I think this is about 18 a
Yeah.
day in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And despite having 3 jabs, Australia, I think, was 97 or much higher than China percentage of people vaccinated. So it's quite clear that the number of people dying with jabs is going to be more than the people who die without jabs, because such a large number are already jabbed. I mean, just about.
Yeah.
Australia went through jab mandates. They mandated it, so you couldn't go to work, you couldn't go to a restaurant, you couldn't go to a bar unless you had a vaccination certificate. That's something China never did, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's true. It is interesting, and goes very much against the narrative that China is authoritarian and Western countries are not. But
Well,
I mean,
there's another point I'd like to add, Jeff, which is this: the 3 years of lockdowns that China went through is bullshit. We did not go through 3 years of lockdown.
Yeah.
Back in 2020, we had lockdowns. That's nearly 3 years ago. It started. We had about a 7-week lockdown in Wuhan, and we had a lockdown where I live. We were not allowed to go out, except one person every second day for 3 hours could go out and go shopping and then come home with supplies. That was it. So when that stopped, after that stopped, that was it. There was no lockdown anywhere in the cities where I've traveled to, and I've traveled to at least 40 cities in the last period. I've been in Hunan, I've been in Hainan, I've been in Shanghai, I've been in Beijing, I've been in Chongqing, I've been in Jiangsu. I've been to many different places over the last 2 years. My wife and I took a 7-week bike ride without a problem.
There was a lockdown in Xinjiang in the fall, right?
Xinjiang had, yes. Shanghai did. There were some lockdowns. There's no question. I mean, there were lockdowns, but these were not. When people say China locked down, there's 1.4 billion people. When you lock down a city of 11 million people, you're locking down 0.8% of the population. When you lock down Shanghai, 25 million people live there. It's not 1% of the population.
Yeah.
Or it is. It's 1.7% of the population, something like that. This is not China-wide. It never was. And travel has been quite free. Yeah, there are some restrictions on time. When you get off the train, you have to have a test. In some places, when you get off the train, you have to scan your code. It causes a bit of a logjam getting out of the train station. Inconvenience, you get into the hotel, you have to have another scan. If you go to a new city, you have to go and get a test in the first day that you're there, and then the third day again. So these kind of things were kind of inconvenient, but there were nothing more than that. They weren't any more serious than inconvenience.
Yeah, and
Karen Phelps is a Labour darling.
Contrast that with your home country of the UK, where in January of 2021, they were like, oh shit, we've let COVID get totally out of control. All these people are dying, like hundreds of people a day were dying, and so they put in a nationwide lockdown that lasted for, I believe, a bit over 4 months, which is like twice as long as any lockdown as there's ever been in China. And compared to what
idiot YouTubers like Jimmy Dore say, it worked. It completely obliterated deaths from COVID in the UK. But my point, I guess, is that, all these hypocritical Westerners are like, oh, China and their draconian lockdowns. And meanwhile, China's never had a nationwide lockdown. The UK has, other Western countries, Australia has.
I believe Melbourne holds the world record for the longest lockdown.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly how many days it was or weeks, but it was something like 210 days of lockdown. My brother lives in Melbourne, and one of the things he told me was that when he was locked down, he was allowed out twice a day for exercise and personal health reasons, mental health issues. So he was allowed out. Now, in his case, he lives in a small apartment with 2 kids. One's a teenager. In fact, they're both teenagers now. During the course of the pandemic, one of them turned into a teenager. So being in a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment with 2 teenagers for 10 weeks or 20 weeks, that's pretty horrendous. And he was allowed out. He could walk down to the beach, but he was finding that people were having parties in his neighborhood. And when the cops came and said, you can't have a party, he said, oh, we all live in the same building. So that was okay then when that happened. So Robert has not had a lockdown where he lives. Where do you live, Robert? That would be interesting to know. They got Melbourne 266 days and Buenos Aires 265 days. Basically, almost a year of lockdown. It's inconceivable that people are saying China is the authoritarian, the draconian state, when in fact we had our phones and we had monitoring and we had tracking. The tracking system actually works really well. It's very, very good. It's very efficient. Yeah. Not to say I haven't had my own problems with it. I did. I've had a few problems with it.
Yeah,
but
and
we got through them.
Comment about this notion that public health measures are authoritarian. Well, okay, maybe strictly speaking they are, but you're doing it for the public good. If you impose a lockdown, you're doing it to prevent people from dying. Yeah. You impose a vaccine mandate in a country like the United States where you have these crazy conspiracy theorists that say vaccines don't work, blah, 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 which is rubbish. That's necessary here. It may not be in China where, there aren't very many people who don't believe in vaccines or who believe nutty conspiracy theories. So you can get away with it. Although I think China would have a better vaccine rate if they did have mandates. So, I think
I don't know that you could get a much better vaccine take-up rate than they have in China. I mean, older people were given incentives. If you're over 65, you come along there and you get a bottle of cooking oil or a bag of rice or something like that. And then this is a great idea, incentivize people to go there. Nobody, peer pressure. It was just peer pressure. Nobody that I know said, I'm not having a vaccine. Actually, I did have one. I've got one American friend. Actually, sorry, he's not American, he's European. He's avoided all of this. He's had no vaccinations. In the time that the pandemic has been on, he's only had 1 COVID test. I don't know how that is possible, but it just means he didn't go out. So yes, and Canada both have vaccine mandates. Canada, they had a freedom rally about this and said, it's my body, my choice. And the government said things like, well, if you want to have that choice, we're going to take away your bank accounts. They froze the bank accounts.
Yeah.
People protesting about it.
Maybe that was an overreaction, but I mean, I followed that pretty closely, and it was pretty chaotic. Ottawa was completely shut down by this, and nobody could go anywhere. They were doing a lot of property damage. Somebody involved with a convoy tried to set an apartment building on fire because people from the apartment building were yelling at them to not be blaring their truck horns at all hours of the night, and were harassing people who were wearing masks and so forth. It was just a zoo. And so although they may have overreacted, the Canadian government did have to do something because it was unacceptable. But I mean, the majority of people in Canada supported the vaccine mandates because they knew that there were people like this running around who, were spreading rumors that the vaccines were harmful and didn't work. So they had to do that to get their vaccination rate up. Whereas you didn't have to do that in China because, there's better education on public health there.
People tend to trust the government a lot more here. I mean, this is a surprise. A lot of Americans, and I know this doesn't count you, Jeff, but and people who follow you, but a lot of Americans seem to think that Chinese people are walking around with some kind of yoke of oppression holding them down, and they need to be rescued and they need to be given a vote in democracy and stuff like that. The fact is that 95%, and this is not just me, Harvard, Statista, there's an index, Edelman Trust Index, Trust Barometer it's called. These are Western researchers who've come to China, and they have found the Harvard research thing took place over 13 years, and they found that the Chinese government satisfaction rate, the people's satisfaction rate in their government, is well over 90%. People tend to trust central government. They believe the government will look after them. That's a fact. They believe that. And the government so far has done so. And it's done so very, very well. And we look at America from here and we say, well, they've had 1 million deaths and we've had 6,000. But it's the same disease. Exactly. And now, even if we get 1 million deaths, which I'm extremely skeptical about that, but even if that were to happen, if we got 1 million deaths in China with 4 times the population, it still proves that China did a better job. Now, if we get 4 million deaths, then we can say, okay, that's 3 years wasted. But I think the 3 years was not wasted time. They've got vaccines, they've got better therapeutics, they've got more hospital beds, they've got many, many, many more fever clinics, and they've got better processes in place to look after people who are sick. And it's all there now.
Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine that China will reach millions of deaths. And on the perception of the government, another survey found that I think it was 83% of Chinese people perceive their government as a democracy, which, people here in the West, they're like, what? How can that be? Those Chinese people must be idiots. But, as we talked about last time, there are local elections in China that are much fairer from what I understand, and they are here because they can't be bought off by, campaign funds.
I've just made a video which my young editing team are working on right now. It should be available tomorrow, exactly about this and why democracy has failed in the West. And I'm certain it has. And I've given some examples of why it has in the video, which will be out possibly tomorrow. I'll chase it up and see. But certainly before the weekend, before the end of the weekend, there will be a video on my channel about exactly that. And I think that the word populism is a new word for democracy in the West. Basically, democracy in the West has gone and populism has taken over. No elected official, no academic dares to speak out on behalf of China because they will either lose votes or they'll lose their job. That's populism.
Yeah. And just to finish the thought about the polls, had the highest rating, I think, or very close to the highest rating of the extent to which its citizens perceived China as a democracy, whereas 83% in China versus I think it was less than 50% of Americans perceived their country as a democracy, and it was also lower in other Western countries. And the proof is in the pudding. 2 years ago, you may recall, we had demonstrations of millions of people in the United States over the cops killing people, which doesn't happen in China. But 1,000 a year approximately are killed by cops here in the United States. And so there were these giant protests, which, among other things, called for defund the police, which doesn't mean get rid of the police. It just means don't give them so damn much money that they have a bigger budget than most countries' militaries. And instead, the response has been to increase the police budget. And this year had the highest number of police killings that we've ever had. So, there's democracy in the United States for you. Versus in China, you had, a very limited and small number of protests over, the zero COVID policy, partly, inspired by Western funded groups, but, some legitimate. Well,
I did a video on why there will never be a color revolution. In fact, not a video, sorry, an article. I could turn it into a video if I wanted to, but it was published in Pearls and Irritations, which is an Australian public policy manual, public policy document run by John Menadue. So in Pearls and Irritations, why a color revolution won't work in China. And the one major factor is there is no dissatisfaction with central government. There's always dissatisfaction with personal inconveniences, things that go wrong. But people generally trust the government. The polls that you say, 83%, I thought that was much higher, actually. But genuinely, there is democracy, and the people in China are happy with the way that their government runs it. They don't want to change. They don't need change, and they certainly don't need American-style change, which, as somebody else pointed out, nobody trusts the politicians. A politician can get elected just by being rich enough to pay for stories in the media. What really happens in China is you get selected and elected. So you can't get elected unless you have the support of your peers, the support of your subordinates, and the support of your leadership. And you need the support of the people who are going to elect you at the very beginning of your career. So at the beginning of your career, you get elected to a local office. And from there on, you get elected up the system through the people who are elected below you. So everybody gets elected above and below themselves. It's very, very important. Robert just made this very, very interesting comment. And I think there's a lot to be said for this. China uses the COVID crisis. I don't think they've ever published that, but I think this is probably very accurate. China has used this as a learning curve for one of two things: biowarfare and the next pandemic. And I think the next pandemic is not that far away.
Yeah. Well, just to finish up on the protests in China, they were pretty small, really, although they reflected perhaps not as great a level of discontent as the protesters, but some discontent with the strictness of the COVID zero policy. So the Chinese government responded not only to that, but to, as you said,
is that not a form of democracy? The people spoke and the government reacted.
Yeah,
that's democracy. That's not populism. That's democracy in action. That's what happens.
To the U.S., where to give another example, we had over 1 million people protesting against the Iraq War, and the government ignored it and went to invade Iraq. Despite everything they said to justify it turning out to be a complete lie.
Even bigger in the UK, even bigger. I think there was more than Europe, and I think combined was 35 million people went out on the streets one weekend about that. Yeah,
I guess
it was huge.
At that time.
Sorry,
were you there at that time?
No, 2003. No, I was in Australia. I'm just trying to think. The first invasion, I was living in Brisbane. The second, I was living in Sydney. I was in Sydney when 9/11 happened. I came to China in 2004, so that what they call the Iraq War was very much underway by then. So no, I wasn't involved in those protest marches, but I've been involved in plenty others while I was in the UK. If anybody's watching and doesn't know, I wasn't a protester. I was one of the policing the protesters. And as someone once said, kicking them in the head, which I never did.
Involved at least in local protests here against the Iraq War. But just to share a little story with your viewers about how the U.S. is more of a police state than China is. In 2001, after 9/11, I traveled to D.C. for a protest against the upcoming U.S. Invasion of Afghanistan, and our position against that was pretty unpopular because people were so, livid about 9/11, which, we have a 9/11 every week in terms of COVID deaths here, and nobody seems to care very much. People were upset about 9/11, and they wanted the U.S. to mostly to go to war in Afghanistan. And so, I think there were maybe 5,000 of us max that were protesting in D.C. Against the Afghanistan war. And at one point, we were surrounded. The whole march was surrounded by hundreds of cops in riot gear, looking very menacing with their billy clubs and so forth. And fortunately, they didn't attack us, but they wouldn't let us go for like a couple of hours. I guess that's my experience with the police here abusing their authority. But obviously, many others have experienced much worse.
You can protest in China. This is something that I made a video about this just a couple of weeks ago, just before Christmas. You can protest. It's actually written into the Constitution. Article 35 of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China allows protest and demonstration. What it doesn't allow is that protest to turn violent, and you're not allowed to incite violence. You're not allowed to encourage violence. But if you want to organize a group of people to go and stand outside of the government office to talk about something, the government leaders are obliged to come out and listen to what you have to say. That's part of the Constitution of China. And so what happens is this. People say, well, they don't have a right of protest in China. Well, they do. They have that right. It's constitutionally granted to them. Article 35 of the People's Republic of China's Constitution says you have a right to protest. That is a fact.
As well.
Now, if anybody wants to tell me what act and section stops people from protesting, I'll happily have a look at that. But so far, I've never found one. Chinese people are allowed to protest, and they do protest. And this is a fact. Now, June the 4th was a color revolution attempt. There was a bipartisan Senate group inside of Beijing, including Nancy Pelosi, at the time that happened. Now, tell me, how did that arise? How did that occur? This woman, Nancy Pelosi, is an evil witch. She's been involved in pretty much everything that is negative about China for the last 40 years. And that seems to be one of her goals. Yet she's making money out of China too, or she was until she was sanctioned recently.
Did you hear about?
Oh, I say, confirming this, Article 35 of the People's Republic of China allows protest. I covered it in my last interview, or my last video as well. So it's out there. It's a fact. You can protest in China, and people do all the time. When the protest gets violent, the police come out. But you know what? Not a single person's ever been shot or beaten to death. Not yet. And it hasn't happened. The last time a person was shot by the police in China, literally the last time, was 2018. That's the last time the police in China shot anyone. And it was a man driving a forklift through a bus station and driving at people. He was shot in order to prevent him killing other people. The time before that was another car being used as a vehicle, as a weapon, and the driver of that was shot by police too. Most police officers don't carry guns, and those that do don't use them very often.
Yeah, and contrast that to here. Now, on one hand, we do have the right to protest, and people protest all the time, just as in China. We can talk on YouTube about whatever we want for the most part, or Twitter, or in public or wherever. So we do have a lot of freedom of speech, although there is also censorship in some respects. But the reaction to the protests over police violence was very violent on the part of the cops. They tear gas.
This is the problem. When you're out there protesting against a violent group of people, because they are, there's approximately 3 people a day getting killed by American police on average. 1,000 a year are getting killed, at least every year in the last 10 or 12 years. 1,000 people a year have been killed. So 3 people a day on average are getting killed by American police. When you protest against that,
Yeah, and so yeah, the reaction to the cops to those protests in 2020, which total millions of people out in the streets, was, I think I read somewhere there were like 100 cities where the cops used tear gas on overwhelmingly peaceful protesters. They were shooting rubber bullets at protesters and at journalists.
Yeah.
They were.
Well, that was the other thing. Journalists kept getting arrested too.
Yeah, they were arresting journalists for covering the protests. So and I could go on and on with the examples, but
it's quite interesting.
A police state. Come on.
A BBC journalist was arrested in Shanghai, and he was kept in custody for a few hours before being released. Now, I have some questions about that. And he says he was kicked and he was punched or beaten. I don't think that would be true, but if it was, then I'm sure he's laid in a formal complaint, and that will be addressed. That's one thing I will say about the police. They will address these issues. Now, the question is, why was he arrested? And my answer to that is probably because he was in a place before something went down and he knew it was going down. They arrested him for one reason and one reason only. They wanted to check his phone. They wanted to see who organized him to be there, because that is the person that the Chinese police say, this is not a peaceful protester. This is a paid, this is a color revolution. This is somebody who is an agitator for some cause, which may or may not be a Chinese person, but somebody told that TV crew where to be, when to be there, because something is going to happen. So I think he was arrested so they could check his phone.
Yeah. I mean, what would the reaction of the police here in the United States be if there were journalists from China and members of groups funded by the Chinese government who were discovered to be on Telegram organizing protests in the United States, where some of the protesters, the ones associated with this group, were calling for the government of the United States to be overthrown? I mean, what would the reaction be?
Yeah, well, I've often wondered what would happen if China sent troops and boats to Puerto Rico or Hawaii and sent money and things to the people who wanted their independence on those two island regions. I think it's quite clear what would happen, and it just seems to be that the Americans' rules-based order is okay for Americans, but it's not okay for anybody else.
Yeah.
So. The Dutch reporter at the Beijing Olympics, that was great because somebody else captured the image of the Dutch reporter who wouldn't move. And the policeman was very polite to him. He said, look, I've already told you, you can't stand here. You have to move behind that post. Go behind the post there and there's no problem. And he said, no, I want to stand here. And it was all done in Chinese, but somebody recorded the whole incident and every Chinese person saw this. Now that guy is persona non grata wherever he goes. The BBC, if they go anywhere in China now, people say I'm from the BBC. They go, fuck off, not interested in talking to you. Nobody wants to talk to the BBC. And then, of course, the BBC says they're all afraid to speak to us because there's a member of the party watching them. No, they're not afraid to speak to you. They don't want words twisted and lied about because that is what the BBC does. John Sudworth, Stephen McDonnell, this new guy, Ed Lawrence, they're all doing it. They're twisting and turning what is a genuine complaint into Xi Jinping has to go. Xi Jinping is unpopular. He's the most popular leader in the world. 1.5 billion people love the man, but a few 100,000 Americans in government don't. And the few million Americans think they don't because they have no idea how good he has been to the people of China. And that's the difference. Yeah. So should we move on?
Sure.
Yeah, we were going to talk about two different topics tonight. The first one was COVID and what was going on. I think we've done all that. Mm-hmm. We were going to also talk about, you're going to tell me a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine, because I have to be honest here. I'm not very well versed on Ukraine. What I see is loads of misinformation, and I don't know what's really happening. So perhaps you can fill me in with what you know.
Okay, well, that would take a while to fill you in on it, what I know, but because ever since the Russian military operation in Ukraine started, I've been kind of obsessing about this topic, and I wrote a long article on it back in May, and I'm working on another one, which I can share with your. You can put the link to the one that I finished in the description if you'd like. But anyway, basically, Ukraine has been kind of a flashpoint for a conflict between Russia and the United States, where I mean, the U.S. Has always, back when the Soviet Union existed, wanted the Soviet Union to collapse. And part of the many things the U.S. did to try and bring that about. There was U.S. proxy war funding the right-wing Islamists in Afghanistan, and sanctions, of course, and so on and so forth. But one thing that the United States did after World War II, they funded and supported, fascist groups in Ukraine, led by Stefan Bandera, that were literally involved in perpetrating the Holocaust. They killed tens of thousands of Jews and Poles and others in Ukraine during World War II. Or maybe more than that. I'm not sure the exact number. And, the U.S. was and Ukraine at the time, of course, is part of the Soviet Union, but the U.S. is funding these kinds of people in Ukraine and some of the other Western republics of the Soviet Union, Latvia, and so forth, trying to basically, bring about the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And then, the combination of, the war in Afghanistan and, just internal economic troubles in the Soviet Union that were not addressed sufficiently, and just a lot of greedy bureaucrats in the Soviet Union who envied all the capitalists getting rich in the West. And so eventually the Soviet Union collapses, and so Ukraine becomes nominally independent. They weren't really independent, but nominally independent. And one thing about Ukraine is that although things were fine when it was part of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, despite its many flaws, managed to keep ethnic conflict in check for the most part. You had in Ukraine a situation where the vast majority of people in the eastern part of the country were ethnic Russians, and the vast majority of people in Western Ukraine were not, and spoke Ukrainian, and a significant portion of them were Ukrainian nationalists. Some of whom were, as I mentioned before, outright fascists who, not only hated Jews but also hated Russians. Were part of the list of people that the Nazis and their allies hated was people of Slavic descent. They regarded them as subhuman, just like they regarded Jews that way. And so that mentality, has existed for a long time among a significant segment of the population, Western Ukraine. So, and of course, because the U.S. backs bad people everywhere, they were, supported these folks. And then,
so let me ask this question. You're an American, and you just said the U.S. backs bad people everywhere.
Yes.
Why don't they back the good guys?
Well, because having people basically, what they want is people who not only repress their country's working class so they can be exploited more, but that are pro-U.S. and pro-Western, and will basically they're willing to plunder their country on behalf of Western corporations. I mean,
I've noticed that something that I picked up and I'm not following this very deeply or very closely, and I keep seeing that Russia is losing the war, but then I keep seeing that Russia is not losing the war at all. But one of the things I have noticed is that companies like Monsanto have masses and masses of land in the Ukraine. Call it the Ukraine from the old days. I'm showing my age there. Ukraine is massively owned by American conglomerates.
Yeah.
Right now, America has just agreed another $45 billion on top of, I don't know, it's about $100 billion has gone into Ukraine coffers over the last 12 months, and masses amounts of loans. These are not gifts. These are not donations. These are loans. How the hell is Ukraine, even if it were to win this war, which I can't see how it happens, how can you take on a superpower like Russia and win, even with the backing? 20%. But what's going to happen when it finishes?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's my question. What's going to happen when this finishes? How is it going to finish?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's going to finish because, Ukraine refuses to surrender to an obviously superior military force, has, taken 20% of their territory under its control. And in fact, by a vote of their populations, for former Ukraine oblasts, I guess is what they call them, republics or states or whatever, are now part of Russia by a popular vote of their citizens. That's 20% of Ukraine, not including Crimea, which voted overwhelmingly to join Russia 8 years ago. That is no longer part of Ukraine because. Okay, well, maybe I should back up to talking about what led up to where we are now some more. So basically, just like they do in China, the U.S. kept trying to foment color revolutions in Ukraine to bring about a government more favorable to their interests. And so they tried that in 2004. They succeeded for a time. But then, as typically happens with a government that completely doesn't serve its people's interests, the government that the U.S. had helped install became so unpopular that the guy I forget his name, was voted out, and a fellow named Yanukovych, who was not pro-Western, he was kind of neutral, was elected overwhelmingly, and he governed for a while, and then. He was offered a loan package through, I believe, through the EU and the International Monetary Fund in 2013, which would have required, as these international lending agencies generally do, the Ukraine government to massively slash the government's social safety net and basically. Just completely open up Ukraine to exploitation by the West. He refused that because Russia offered him a better deal. And this provoked outrage in the West, as well as among that faction of the population in Western Ukraine that is very pro-Western, pro-European, and so forth. And so there were protests in 2013 on into 2014. In Kiev and assorted other cities in Ukraine, and part of the people involved in the protests were these right-wing ultranationalists, the Azov, later battalion organization, and Adar, and I forget the name of the political party, but also a fascist Ukrainian.
But this is an interesting thing as well, because in the last few months I've seen that Zelensky has cancelled all opposition parties. There is no opposition anymore, but this is a democracy. He's closed down everything except state media.
Right.
But this is a free-speaking democracy.
Right.
And he's even banned Orthodox religion because Orthodox religion is kind of Russian influenced or Eastern influenced. And so we've got a situation there where they're fighting for democracy. But this is what I keep hearing. Whenever I switch on a news report, I say the fight is for freedom and the fight is for democracy. But the fact is, there is no freedom in Ukraine if you are anti whatever is mainstream. There is no democracy. Oh, and unions. Yes, they got rid of unions too. So we've got a situation there where this fight for democracy, this fight for freedoms, this fight for human rights is completely and totally farcical, because there is no democracy, there are no freedoms, and human rights are being abused right, left, and center. So why is that being underreported in America just because America wants these bad guys to win?
Yeah. There's an interesting, funny graphic somebody created where they did a collage of all the Western media reports on Nazi/fascist Ukrainian nationalist elements in Ukraine before February 2014, when Russia launched its military operation. It's very easy to find honest accounts of that in Western media outlets before February 24th, and then all of a sudden afterwards, it's just totally whitewashed.
It's gone the opposite way.
February, this collage of stories about Nazis in Ukraine after February 24th. Slava Ukraine.
They're not Nazis anymore.
If you look at the, speaking of Nancy Pelosi, if you look at the flag that, Ukrainian flag that she and...
it still had an SS on it.
There's it's signed by a bunch of people, but one of the signatures has an SS symbol on it. Of course, that wasn't commented on in the Western media. And you just so often see, soldier. Well, in fact, the head of the Ukrainian military, Zalushny, I believe is his name. There's a portrait of Stefan Bandera, this leader of the, World War II era Nazis in Ukraine, on his wall.
Well, he is a hero in Ukraine. That's the fact. I mean, there's no getting away from that. He's the hero of Ukraine. How does it all end? Where does it go? What's your? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the end of this conflict, but what could go? What could happen? We're only a couple of months short of a year since this special military operation, which other people call a brutal invasion, and people are now calling the Ukraine war. But the fact is, we're coming towards the first year. It's in February. It's only a couple of months away. How is it going to end? What's your opinion? I mean, I know I'm not going to ask you to predict and hold you to this and say you said this, but what do you think can happen?
Well, I mean, only one thing can happen. Russia's going to win, and the reason it's taking so long, despite the fact that this surprised me. I didn't know this before, but Russia actually has. They spend only a fraction of what the U.S. does on their military, but the U.S. wastes an absurd amount of money and also has to fund all those, 800 or so overseas military bases. Russia's military budget is like a tenth of the U.S.'s, but they spend it much more efficiently. And in fact, they have the most advanced and capable conventional military in the world. It's better than the U.S. Ukraine, despite, as former German Prime Minister Angela Merkel conceded the peace treaties, the Minsk Accords that were signed in 2014 and 2015 to try and stop the civil war that broke out, were essentially to buy time for Ukraine to arm itself. And it now has a very formidable military, probably the best army in Europe other than Russia. So, it wasn't a pushover, but, Russia from the very beginning, had overwhelming military superiority. They had superiority in terms of tanks, in terms of, anti, missile defense, air superiority, you name it. They had all this over Ukraine and over, frankly, any country in Europe. But the reason they called it a special military operation was that they went in with a very limited number of troops, something like 150,000 troops, and Ukraine had before they started all getting killed, something like 400,000. And they just had very limited objectives. Their objectives were to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. And I guess I should back up and say, what happened to bring? Oh, you've gone, Jerry. Are you still there? Jerry, can you hear me? Oh shoot! There you are.
Yeah, we lost both of us for a moment there. We're back. I'm not sure what happened. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, you were just about to back up.
Just back up and say what happened to lead up to February 24th. As I said, there were these protests which took place in 2013 and 2014. The Maidan protests in Kiev and protests in other cities in Ukraine. Against the government's decision to reject the Western-funded loans and go with Russian loans and some other issues that they brought up, where a big element in the protests, and in fact the most aggressive element, was these far-right fascists backed by the United States. So eventually in February of 2014, there was a coup. The president of Ukraine had to flee for his life and flee to Russia, and so did a lot of his staff. And so a coup government took over, which, interestingly enough, a lot of foreigners were literally, officials in the new Ukrainian government, including lots of Americans, officials in this government of Ukraine.
That's really interesting, because the Australian government is getting advised by two former US retired Navy admirals. It seems like if you spend some time in the US military, you can retire and go and advise in another country now. It's not a bad little ploy, is it?
Yeah. So they did eventually have a quasi-legitimate election where this fellow named Poroshenko was elected, and he was, a far-right guy, but not literally a fascist. So, they can get away with having him in there.
So do you think this is true? I saw an article a little while ago that said the U.S. military-industrial complex lost $40 billion when America left Afghanistan, $40 billion a year.
Wow.
And they would need a limited war at least in order to recover. And I do remember, I'm not an investor and I don't follow investments much, but I do remember that Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, they're all of them started to go down. Now they're all rising back up. Is this all this is? Is there more to it than this, or is this really all that it is? The military-industrial complex and the politicians lining their pockets, laundering taxpayers' money through this war system and back into their own pockets. Because you said about the inefficiencies, China has a much bigger navy, a much bigger army, and it has a very, very advanced technology, but it spends only 20 to 30% of what America spends.
Right.
So there's obviously great inefficiencies there. Are those inefficiencies just fat pockets of the CEOs, the politicians, and maybe Zelensky's cocaine habit, if the rumors are true?
Yeah, well, Zelensky's riches in general. But that's a big part of what's going on. But as far as what's motivating the policy in Ukraine, that's not all there is. Because, as I was saying, it was long the stated objective of the U.S. to, get rid of the Soviet Union. They accomplished that. And then, they didn't want to stop there. They wanted to dismember Russia as well, because Russia, this vast country with more natural resources than any other country, sitting there waiting for the West to exploit it if they could. So, the U.S. managed to. Boris Yeltsin was from the very beginning, the president of Russia during the 1990s, a U.S. Western puppet, basically, in fact, Western economists such as Jeffrey Sachs, advised the Russian government on how to basically, set up their
Dismantle.
economy for Western exploitation, basically. And so there was a free-for-all, a plunder of Russia's resources, both by people who had quickly become oligarchs because they bought up state assets at fire sale prices, and Westerners who were doing the same thing. And so as a result, the 1990s was an absolute disaster in Russia. Their GDP declined by something like 50%. Their life expectancy declined by over 5 years. Everybody hates Putin these days, but the reason why this hatred of Putin has been fostered is that although he has many flaws, there are many political disagreements with the guy that I have. He rescued Russia from the absolute disaster that Yeltsin had created, and put Russia back on its feet economically. And it's still a kind of a middle of the pack country in terms of GDP, but it's doing far better than it was in the 90s. And has, although not as fast as China, been growing steadily, and its resources it uses for itself. Like, even though it's a capitalist country, the banking system and most of the natural resources are under state control, so that they
same in China.
Yeah. And so of course the U.S. and the West hate that.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this comment. U.S. wants resources everywhere. It's not a very well-known fact, but there's a chemical compound which is known as fire ice. It's an ice gas which contains methane, and it's 15 times more efficient than methane gas, liquefied natural gas. So I don't know if anyone realizes this, but one of the world's largest supplies of it is in Russia. The second largest supply is 100 kilometers off the coast of Hong Kong. And this would have some bearing on why we're having these conflicts. Yeah. It's 15 times more efficient than liquefied natural gas, and it's cleaner than it's methane, but it's cleaner to burn than natural gas. And of course, you can, because it's 15 times more efficient, you can take 15 times as much of it on one ship or through one pipeline. But it is actually ice. It's a form of ice, and it doesn't go through pipelines. But once this technology is developed, this is going to be really interesting. The other thing that most people don't know is that Xinjiang, in the northwest of China, which is where the Uyghur population are supposedly being eradicated, genocided, human rights abused, and all the rest of the things that are not actually happening. And I know this for a fact because I've been there several times. I've even cycled through the area myself. I've seen and met real Uyghurs in the streets, and there's not a genocide going on, I can assure you. But that area has got China's greatest natural resource reservoirs of gas and oil and a few other things as well. But it's an area where if America could get control of, they would have control of so much of the world's future energy needs through Hong Kong, Russia, and Northwest China. So that's an interesting one, that they're after resources everywhere, I think.
And just to make crystal clear, what the U.S. is up to in Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, in 2019, the RAND Corporation, which is a U.S. government-funded think tank in the United States, released a report where basically they explicitly said that the U.S.'s objective should be to overthrow the Russian government and dismember Russia into little republics to better that the U.S. could control and exploit it. Lloyd Austin in April of this year said that the objective of the U.S. Proxy war in Ukraine, U.S. Backing of Ukraine's military in its conflict with Russia, was to weaken Russia. So that's just an openly admitted objective of Ukraine.
So the US deliberately provoked a war which Russia started. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the US started a war, provoked a war, and the benefit to the US is enormous. They basically, whatever is left of Ukraine when this war is over, America will own it. Whatever income comes out of Ukraine when this war is over will be needed to repay the debt. Whatever is left of Russia, if in the very unlikely event that Russia were to lose this war, then America benefits from that too. Now, I don't see how Russia can lose this war if it doesn't escalate. If it escalates, then they could. But if it doesn't escalate, I don't see how that can happen.
Well, no, they don't have the capability to escalate unless they go nuclear, in which case we all.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I mean.
Ukraine. They're running out of weapons to give Ukraine. They can't supply them with enough ammunition, not enough tanks, not enough artillery. Russia has something like an 8-1 advantage in artillery, and that's not going to change.
So why then, Jeff? Why then are these intelligent people who manage this situation, from the White House administration, from the State Department, the Defense Department, the Pentagon, why are these people continuing what is clearly a losing war?
Well, for one thing, as you said, it's very profitable. And for another, as Lloyd Austin said, they believe that they're going to weaken Russia. And they genuinely believed that between the draconian economic sanctions that they imposed on Russia would bring Russia to its knees. And in fact, what it's done is it's backfired and brought Europe to its knees economically, because Europe depends on Russia for natural gas and oil. But they believed that they would be able to weaken Russia, and it didn't pan out that way.
It's a war of attrition right now, but Russia can throw in so much more.
Yeah, and in fact, Russia has mobilized about 300,000 troops, and there will soon be and Russia has been preparing this through. Unfortunately, they tried to hold off doing this, but they eventually decided they had to, obliterating Ukraine's infrastructure, such as their power grid and so forth, that could be used to support their military. The gloves are off now. Russia, the reason they called it a special military operation is because they went in soft, hoping that Ukraine would see that they were outmatched and surrender, or negotiate a settlement, which they were actually about to reach an agreement with Ukraine in April of this year. And Boris Johnson, undoubtedly at the behest of the U.S., flew into Ukraine, met with Zelensky, and told him, look, we will not support you if you agree to peace with Russia. The result has been that Ukraine has refused to surrender, despite being so badly outmatched, and despite, it's hard to know how many casualties there have been, but somewhere between 100 and 200,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed, which is several times as many as Russian troops have been killed. Although,
I saw a figure that said the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian troops was 30-1. The death ratio.
I think it's more like 5 or 6-1. I think I've about 20,000 Russian dead, and about twice that number wounded, I guess. I guess I never did. And this is important for people to know if they don't finish talking about what's been happening in Ukraine for the last 8 years. After the coup overthrew the existing Ukrainian government, there were protests against the coup in eastern Ukraine, Odessa, and Melitopol, and a number of Donetsk, and a number of other cities in eastern Ukraine. In Odessa, there was a massacre by the right-wing forces of protesters there, where they either burned alive or shot about 50 people. There was just, as you talked about, there's still massive repression in Ukraine now. under Zelensky. And there was at that time, of course, too, people who were against the government were being assassinated, thrown in jail, tortured, etc. And in mid 2014, the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian right-wing paramilitaries launched an attack on the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine. And there's basically been a civil war there, for the last 7 years, where, or 8 years, I guess now, 8 years, where approximately 14,000 people, about half of them civilians, and then Donbass militias and Ukrainian troops have been killed. So, if you consider that the population of the Donbass region is only 3 million, several thousand civilians who have been deliberately targeted by the Ukrainian military. No military targets anywhere in downtown Donetsk, which gets bombed several times a week or shelled several times a week. There's no military targets there. They're trying to kill civilians, and that considering the population of the Donbass is only 3 million, when you have like 10,000 civilians being killed, I mean, that's a genocide. And so the reason that
how many genocides are going on around the world right now that we're not hearing about? Because I know of one that we're hearing about on a regular basis, which is not actually a genocide. But how many of them are going on around the world now that we're not hearing about? Any idea?
Well, I don't have any clear idea, but I know that it's a regular occurrence, and we usually hear about it.
I just found some information about a situation going on in Punjab, in India, where Sikhs are being racially discriminated, religiously discriminated. They're being, in some cases, they're being shot in the streets. And this is happening in Kashmir as well with Muslims in India. Now, in Australia and America, there has been a referendum by the Sikhs who would like to have some degree of autonomy or independence. They're looking for independence, and they're going to take this to the United Nations. But of course, we're not hearing about that. America, back in October last year, London in June of this year, Vancouver, I think was last year as well. And this month, next month, January the 28th, there will be a referendum in Melbourne in Australia about the Sikhs getting independence for a country that they want to call Khalistan, which is actually the area which we know now as the Punjab. And it's been really interesting for me. I found this information out quite by accident. I was looking at something else, and what's going on here? And there's a whole genocide going on in this area of the Punjab, which we don't know about because it's in one of our Five Eyes, not Five Eyes, Quad. India is one of the Quad, and it's one of our friends. It's a democracy, so therefore it's okay to kill people. It's a democracy. There's one going on in Myanmar at the moment. There's one going on in Kashmir. There's probably one going on. The Americans are doing one in Venezuela. They're trying to do it in Iran. There's a lot of these things going on, and we're just not hearing about them. Yeah, Darway, it's a referendum in Vancouver. Yes, for Khalistan.
Yeah. One of our viewers just commented that Patrick Lancaster was a good journalist.
That was me. I put that up there because I know someone who knows him quite well, and so I tried to follow him for a while there. He's out there on the front lines in
he's been all over eastern Ukraine, on the front lines quite often. Another Ava Bartlett is another good person to follow who's covered Ukraine extensively. She did a great article on Crimea, countering the Western disinformation that Crimea was conquered by Russia or something, when in fact Crimeans voted in a free and fair referendum by something like 96% to join Russia. And she interviewed people, and overwhelmingly, they're very happy to be part of Russia and not part of Ukraine anymore. Their economy is prospering, whereas Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe. and they are not unlike in the rest of Ukraine, or what's left of Ukraine. They do not have their freedom to speak and be educated in the Russian language being taken away as it is in the rest of Ukraine. So they're a lot better off, and so over the course of this past 8 years, with a civil war going on in eastern Ukraine, and then of course when Russia came in February, it spread to other parts of eastern Ukraine that had previously not been war zones. And people were just fed up with constantly, their lives being in danger when they hadn't done anything wrong. Being endangered by either the Ukrainian government forces or fascist paramilitary, which are now part of the Ukraine military, generally speaking.
They weren't, but they are now. Is that right?
Yeah. And so they held referendums in 4 oblasts or republics in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, which were the 2 republics in that make up the Donbass region that had already, back in 2014, voted for independence from Ukraine. And the Minsk peace accords basically called for them to remain part of Ukraine but have autonomy, and in exchange Ukraine would agree to not join NATO and stop attacking those regions and basically leave them alone. Ukraine, of course, ignored that treaty. And in fact, as I was mentioning, Angela Merkel, as well as former President Poroshenko of Ukraine, admitted that the treaties were just a way to buy time for them to build up their military so they could attack the Donbass later, basically.
Yeah.
Didn't say that last part.
I know that this is a good point that Polly Sporin has just raised. Movies by Oliver Stone. They've been banned on Netflix and Amazon, but they are still available on YouTube, I think.
Yes.
I saw the Oliver Stone one.
That's right.
And another good one is John Pilger's, I can't remember the name of it, something about the road to war with China. John Pilger did an excellent job, and that's available free on YouTube as well, of a similar nature, which basically shows how these things have escalated and got to the point where it happened. Now, once it's happened, we're left in a really interesting situation, because now that this has happened, there is so much misinformation that nobody believes half of the truth. And then when you do see something, you say, well, I can't believe that. It may be true, but I just can't believe what's coming out of are the Russians telling the truth? Are the Ukrainians telling the truth? Are the Americans telling the truth? Now, the way I view this is, if one side of the story is telling me, I'm not going to allow you to see the other side of this story because it's not true, I would say, what are they hiding? Why don't they want me to form my own opinion?
YouTube has banned RT and other Russian media outlets throughout the world. The censorship is happening on the Western side. And I have no doubt that, just like the Chinese government or any other government, the Russian government or the media in Russia leave out things that they don't want to talk about. But I've never caught them telling a lie. Whereas I catch the U.S. media lying all the time. But I mean, even if you don't trust RT or whatever, I mean, as you said, there's Patrick Lancaster, there's Ava Bartlett, there are
there's people on the ground. Now this comment draws me to a question. It's where the UN peacekeepers should be brought in for Donbass, Crimea, places like that, to keep the peace on both sides. Here's the question: why haven't the United Nations put this up as a suggestion already?
Well, because the U.S. would veto it. But
who will veto it?
The U.S.
So effectively, the U.S. will veto any peace, no matter, even if it's a UN brokered peace.
Well, I mean, for now, but I mean, eventually they're going to have to face reality, because Ukraine is collapsing. But just to finish what I was saying about the referendums in eastern Ukraine. So the Donbass regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, which had already voted for independence, and then the Kherson region and the I think you said it's called Zaporizhia. I'm not sure how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
Those four regions voted in percentages ranging from like 85 to 98% to leave Ukraine and join Russia in September. And people like Ava Bartlett and Patrick Lancaster were on the ground reporting and interviewing people, during this, and they basically could not find anybody who was willing to talk to them, at least, who did not support joining Russia. And the reason is, during the referendum, there were still people being killed in the Donbass by deliberately targeted by Ukrainian artillery.
So here's my view. Well, you've hit a nail right on the head here. I live in China, and I have done for 18 years. I've traveled extensively. I've studied. I've worked. I'm married in China. I know China pretty well. I wouldn't call myself an expert. But what I do know is that almost everything that I read about China in the Western media is wrong. It's misunderstood, misinterpreted. It's an outright lie, or it's just a misunderstanding, but it's definitely wrong. So I know that about China. Yeah. Now that I'm reading anything about Venezuela, about Iran, about Cuba, about North Korea, about Ukraine, Russia, when I read anything in Western media, I say, well, how can I accept that is true when I know for a fact that everything they tell me about something I do know about is untrue? So I'm not an expert on China, but I live here. I go out in the streets and I see it every day, and I know they're telling me lies about China. Right. I know. Yeah. And earlier on, we were talking about in Melbourne, Dan Andrews won the election despite massive amount of publicity to say that he wouldn't win the election. And the reason he won the election is because Murdoch's press, the social media press, all of these things cannot lie to you about something you know about, but they will lie to you about something you don't know about. And I think that's what's happening here.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've written a lot and talked a lot about recently about all these Western leftists are just completely out of step with public opinion in the global South, in the rest of the world, about China and about the situation in Russia and Ukraine. They basically they just accept without too much questioning a lot of what the Western media tells them, and are just out of touch with how the rest of the world thinks about. So, in the West, China is very unpopular. The Chinese government is very unpopular. In most of the global South, people have a favorable opinion of the Chinese government, and same with Russia. I have my criticisms of Putin. He's certainly no socialist, but what he's doing.
It's not a socialist country. He doesn't have to be.
Well, these Communist Party is number 2 in the Duma in Russia, so it's not like they got. And by the way, it was the communists who were pushing the hardest for Russia to intervene in Ukraine and to make Eastern Ukraine part of Russia. Years ago, they were pushing for Putin to do this, and it went contrary to this notion that Putin is intent on conquering Eastern Europe and creating this new Russian empire. It was Putin who refused until just early this year, when there were tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops gathered on the border with the Donbass, ready to invade, and the shelling of the Donbass dramatically escalated, and they got intelligence apparently that Ukraine was about to launch an invasion, and people came to Putin, legislators came to Putin, and were like, "Look, you got to do something. They're going to commit genocide in the Donbass." And so finally, the Putin government acted. But back in January, there was a resolution introduced in the Russian Parliament, the Duma, to call for or to invite the Donbass region to join Russia, and it was pushed by the Communist Party. That was the main driving force behind it.
Does Putin have the support of the Russian people?
Much more so than any president of the U.S. in recent history has had of the American people. I think Biden's approval rating is hovering around 40 or 45%. Putin's is, from what I've seen, between about 70 and 80%. And that's been pretty consistent for a while.
Does Zelensky have the approval of the Ukrainian people?
I'm not sure what it's been during the war. I imagine it's pretty low now because things are going completely down the toilet. But back in December of 2021, before this February escalation occurred, he had like 20% approval rating, something like that.
How many?
20%.
20%. Oh my God. Yeah, no wonder we went to war.
Yeah, I mean, pattern
it's a fact that war will help your approval rating.
Yeah, it might have gone up after the war started, but it might have gone down since then. I don't know. But I mean, that's been the basic pattern is in Ukraine is anytime they have a Western-backed leader, even if he is popularly elected, which Zelensky was and Poroshenko was, and his predecessor was, within a short period of time, they screw things up so badly. Ukraine's the most corrupt country in Europe, and its economy is the poorest country in Europe. Within a short period of time, their approval rating tanks. So Poroshenko, the sitting president of Ukraine in 2019, when Zelensky ran against him, got something like 5% of the vote, and Zelensky had like 70.
Wow.
But since then, Zelensky's popularity also tanked.
Right. Okay. What's the truth in the Victoria Nuland situation? Did she really manipulate the situation so Zelensky became the president?
Well, not Zelensky, but
before Zelensky.
The U.S. was involved in promoting the Maidan coup, and there's a famous.
I've heard the phone conversation, and
yeah.
I mean, it's incredulous. This is fuck the EU was one of the phrases used. Simply, they don't really give a toss about anybody else's views on this if it doesn't fit with American interests.
Yeah, and quite clearly we don't know for sure who was behind the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. We know for sure it wasn't Russia sabotaging their own pipeline, as a lot in the West tried to claim, because that would be
because they could have just turned it off.
They could just turn it off if they wanted. But the evidence points toward the UK being involved, and in all likelihood the United States, because of course the United States is the one who would benefit most from this, and. Call
me a little bit cynical about this, because I try to think deeper and deeper every time, and I try to think critically and cynically. But there is one scenario in which Russia might have done it. I'm not saying they did. I'm not suggesting they did. But there is a scenario in which they might have done it, because they could see that the European Union's support was bolstered by American support. The European Union, if it got all of its oil cut off, all of its gas cut off, would freeze over winter. And it's doing so right now. People are really, really struggling in terms of the cost of the gas and the supply of the gas and the power. So people are really struggling now. It's just conceivable. I'm not saying this is true, but it's just conceivable that Russia did that in order to drive a wedge between the United States and their support for Europe by pretending America was in charge of this. America was responsible for this. Now, if America were responsible for this, they are the only country that would profit. They are the country, the president did say, don't worry about Nord Stream, we can stop it if we want to. He did say that. And I mean, that's on record. So having had that set up situation, Is it possible that Russia did it, hid
No.
the fact that they did it, place the blame squarely on the Americans, the Brits, and the Swedes, and whoever else that they want to place the blame on, and then sit back and watch the infighting going on between Europe and America?
Well,
Just
no,
a thought.
it's plausible that they did it because it's not in their interests.
No, of course it's not in their. But is it in their interest to have Europe and America divided? That would be in their interests.
Well, I mean, I think that Europe and America were already starting to become divided because there were a lot of protests in Europe and a lot of public sentiment in Europe. Hey, this sanctions against Russia are killing us. We need you to approve Nord Stream so we can get some gas in so our economy won't tank. And the other thing is, I mean, as you said, Russia could simply turn the gas off if they wanted. And the other thing is where the sabotage took place, Russia would easily have been detected if they had been the ones who done it. And, the West would all be saying
nobody's been detected.
Huh?
And yes, it is easier to turn it off. But if you turn it off, that makes Russia the bad guy. If
Right.
America are believed to have destroyed it, and even Liz Truss sent the text, "It's done." What was that about? So we've got this situation going on. I am playing a three-dimensional chess game here and just throwing this out as the devil's advocate and saying, it's technically possible Russia did it. They tried to plant it so it looked like America supported, Britain did it, Sweden helped them out. Sweden are now investigating it and can't find any information. It's been swept under the carpet. Nobody knows who actually did it. And certainly it looks like the country that benefited the most, the country that had the most to gain, the country that had said they were going to do it, they're all America, which makes them the perfect patsy. If you really wanted to drive a wedge between America and Europe, that would be a perfect way of doing it.
I mean, the fact that they're not talking about who did it, and they know who did it because they investigated it, the fact that they are not talking about who did it is the telltale sign that it's somebody who did it that they don't want people to think did it.
I'm inclined to agree with you. Either that or they can't prove it.
And then, the flip side, if they had evidence said Russia had done it, they would not have dropped talking altogether about who did it. They would have kept saying Russia did it. Look, here's the evidence. That's what would have happened if they had evidence that Russia did it. I'm
not saying they did. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just giving a scenario where it's possible. I like the story. I think it's a great story. Drive a wedge between Europe and America is probably a good thing.
Okay, but that's happening anyway, or that was happening anyway, because Europe's economy was getting tanked by the sanctions that the U.S. was pressuring Europe to keep in place. I mean, Europe decided to cut off their own gas supply. I mean, that was and is killing their economy. And it's like a complete economic basket case now, and it's only going to get worse. And that is because of the sanctions against Russia. And now, they literally can't get cheap gas from Russia. So
it's just an interesting scenario. We've been talking for an hour and 40 minutes. This is one of our my longest live streams ever. I'm sorry, I keep.
So was our other one.
I've got the little touch of COVID stuff still happening here, the cough, which is where we started. Where's it all going? This is a final question. Where's it all going? What do you see? What's the end result? This time next year, what will we be looking at? Prediction for the year 2023.
In an article I wrote for my Substack, The Elephant in the Room is the Elephant in the Room is the title. It's basically about the fact that the U.S. has had, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and continues to have to some extent, hegemony over the world militarily, economically, and so forth. And it is willing to do just about anything to maintain that, including, for example, blowing up Nord Stream, waging a proxy war in Russia or in Ukraine against Russia or what have you. So it will continue to do that. Flying Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan to foment unrest, etc. It's going to keep doing that, but China is getting economically stronger and stronger. Russia is getting stronger and stronger. All these countries, including some unlikely countries like Saudi Arabia, are all getting together and forming a partnership to help each other economically and to protect themselves against the U.S. and its allies. So you have, on the one hand, the G7, which is like most of the countries in the G7 are increasingly in bad shape as a result of the self-sabotage, the sanctions, and a lot of other reasons, versus the steadily growing BRICS, which I think the way this is going is that the U.S. is eventually going to lose its hegemony, and we're headed toward a multipolar world where, despite what you may hear, even from some leftists in the West, that it's just a power struggle between a bunch of imperialists. In fact, the Chinese government and many of these other governments, mostly at this point, seem to have good intentions and seem to genuinely want to better the economic circumstances and so forth of people around the world. So, barring nuclear war or complete catastrophe in terms of climate change, both of which could happen, I think I hope that we're headed for a better situation as the U.S. Starts to lose its political and economic dominance over the world.
Yeah. Did you see what happened in Taiwan this week?
I did not.
Okay, Taiwan has just increased military service from 4 months to 1 year. Very unpopular, very, very unpopular with young Taiwanese people. I worked in a school here a few years ago full of Taiwanese kids, and they hated the idea that most of them were trying to defer military service, and it was only 4 months military service, but they were trying to defer it, going off to university, doing master's degrees, but eventually they had to come back and do their service. And now she's just extended the service. But more importantly, she's also linked so there are interoperable facilities between Japan and Taiwan now. And that is really going to upset the Chinese government. I can see this one causing a lot of trouble. It's probably the most provocative thing that the president, Tsai Ing-wen, has done since she's been president, and she has now linked the Taiwanese military with the Japanese rising sun flag, and that to many Chinese people is a horror. It's the horrors of the Second World War are still very, very deeply etched in Chinese people. So for her to link with Japan is really bad.
I mean, I just edited by the way, if anybody needs a good professional editor, I'm your guy for that. But I just edited a piece about sexual slavery by the Japanese during their occupation of China in Taiwan during World War II.
The comfort ladies,
comfort ladies, right?
This is going to help. This is going to help the KMT, I think, in the next. Tsai Ing-wen just recently lost a very important local by-elections, and her party has lost power. So the KMT is coming back. KMT are actually more pro reunification and less pro. Very few people in Taiwan are pro-independence. They're much more pro the status quo. They don't want to be part of China. I'm not saying that's true, but they are very much pro the status quo rather than independence. And KMT are a little bit more aligned towards the view that maybe they'll come back. I've got a feeling that there'll be negotiations and it will become a special administrative region like Hong Kong and Macau. I mean, you've never heard of any problems with Macau. There aren't any. You don't hear of any problems with Hong Kong now. All you hear is headlines. You read headlines, but they're not really problems. I think it's going to be interesting how this goes in the future.
It's really ironic that the KMT, this initially right-wing landlord-based party that fought a civil war with the Communist Party of China, back in the 20th century, is now the more pro-independence, pro-reunification with China faction in Taiwan. That's kind of an interesting turn of events.
Here's an interesting question for you. Were you on Paul Woodson's World War II TV YouTube channel, WW2 TV channel?
No, I haven't heard of that. I'd be interested.
That's not you. It's a different Jeff Melton.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. It's maybe someone who looks like you. Yeah. Anyway, we got to an hour and 50 minutes. Let's just put it up again where people can find you. It's at the Bitter Pill, right?
Yeah, on YouTube, and then on Twitter, I'm at Lefty Vegan, and I think it's at the Bitter Pill 1 is the YouTube channel.
Lefty Vegan. I assume you actually are a vegan. I know you're a lefty.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's at Lefty Vegan. Did I spell that right?
Let's see. No, Lefty.
Oh, sorry, Lefty. On Twitter. So there you go. I'll just put that up there. So
Lefty.
A great. PV Will says a fellow vegan. Hang on, I'm trying to show. Yeah, that one. Lefty vegan on Twitter, at Lefty Vegan, and at the Bitter Pill on YouTube. Yes. So these are places where we can find you. I think we need to give ourselves a name. You know, like the Duran is very famous, and you and I are meeting now once a month, maybe, and we can talk about China interest, American interest, and we should give ourselves a name. We should think about that. Maybe people can tell us in the comments what we should call ourselves.
Yeah, that would be great. But just if I could add I'm doing more written commentary than videos currently, and my Substack is just jeffmelton.substack.com. And a very long Melton.substack.com. Is that right? A very long and detailed article on Ukraine that I put out in May. Some recent pieces on China, and then I'm coming out in the next few days with one that's kind of an update on Ukraine, but kind of a response as well to a socialist here in the States who's part of the DSA, where I'm kind of, he's pro-peace, but there's some things he doesn't understand about what's going on in Ukraine, so I'm kind of pointing out where he's gone wrong.
Be interesting to read that.
Yeah.
Okay. Refreshingly old school. That's you and I. I like that. I do like that. Refreshingly old school. I like to think of myself as old school. I think we're both close to retirement age, aren't we? I think you're younger than me.
So yeah, we're getting up there.
Yeah, getting up there. So refreshingly old school. That's definitely us. Try not to get too excited. Try and keep the language expletive free, that kind of thing. And basically trying to tell the truth as we see it in both of our countries and both of our fields of interest. Yeah, so
that's what the name of my channel is based on. And my Substack is also called that, even though it's under my name as the address, the Bitter Pill, because I'm telling people bitter pills of truth that they may not want to hear.
Okay, the East-West Clarion is a nice one. I like that. Okay. And this one, Jeffries, I don't know if we. There's a Jerry and a Jeff, so yeah, we could work on that. So I don't know, but I quite like this one, the East-West Clarion. I think that's a pretty good one. You're in the West, I'm in the East. But I think because we're coming up towards the second hour now, and I really am I'm getting drier and drier as we go on. So I think before I have my next coughing fit, I'm going to call it a night and get a glass of cold water, warm water, because I'm in China. You must drink warm water. And I think we should set up a time once a month where we get together and we do this. Your StreamYard or my StreamYard, it doesn't matter. It's not me interviewing you or you interviewing me. It's just we interview each other and chat. So do you think we should do it next month and call ourselves the East-West Clarion?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so
well,
hopefully.
David says to thank both gentlemen, and I agree with this sentiment. A happy New Year to you and yours too. To everybody out there. We got up. We didn't quite make the 100 viewers. We got up to 90 something. I saw 94 or 95. So we didn't quite make the 100. But I think that was quite a good little show tonight. And we'll do this again in 1 month or about 1 month.
Yeah, that sounds good. And just to refresh my memory, I guess I can just download this podcast directly from StreamYard.
Yes, I'll send you a link to it, but it'll be a long one. It'll be very big because it downloads in 1080p, so it'll be like 60 gigabytes or something. It'll be quite big, and then we can put it on yours. But I'll send you a link to it anyway, so you can. All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Almost 100 of you, and a very happy New Year to everyone. Oh, where's my East-West Clarion? I should lose that. Hide that one again. So there you go. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Jeff, for your company tonight. And we'll get together again in about a month's time.
That sounds great.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, and a good night to everyone. I'm now going to say end broadcast and good night.